Good day, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We have people coming in from all sorts of different time zones, but it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our session today, The Call of Creation, responding to a joint message for the protection of creation. On September 1st, 2021, Pope Francis, Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, issued a joint message for the protection of creation, calling on the world to address the current crisis of global climate change. In this message, these three Christian leaders ask us all, regardless of belief or worldview, to respond simultaneously to the needs of the earth and the needs of the poor, to choose to live differently and to choose life for our descendants and for the world in which they will live. And the message was issued at the beginning of the 2021 season of creation, but also in advance of next weekend's UN Climate Change Conference set to gather in Glasgow, Scotland. This event today is co-sponsored by Georgetown University's Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs and its Department of Theology and Religious Studies, in partnership with the Ecclesiological Investigations International Research Network and the Graymore Ecumenical and Interreligious Institute. My name is Brian Flanagan. I'm Associate Professor of Theology at Marymount University in Arlington, Virginia, and a member of the steering committee of the Ecclesiological Investigations International Research Network. Two logistics announcements before I introduce our distinguished panel. First, this webinar is being recorded, and the captioned video will be posted to the event page on the Berkeley Center's website soon. If you registered for today's event, you will also receive an email with the captioned video when it becomes available. In the last 15 to 20 minutes of our time together, we'll answer questions from the audience. So please join the conversation by opening the Q&A box at the bottom right of the Zoom screen and typing in your questions for the panel. I'm going to introduce our speakers now in the order in which they will speak. Our first speaker will be the Reverend Dr. John Chrysavgis, Archdeacon of the Ecumenical Patriarch. Father John was born in Australia, studied theology in Athens, and completed his doctorate in Oxford. He's taught theology in Sydney and Boston, and currently serves as a theological advisor to the Ecumenical Patriarch. His latest book is Creation as Sacrament, Reflections on Ecology and Spirituality. Dr. Jose Casanova is one of the world's top scholars in the sociology of religion and a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, where his work focuses on globalization, religions, and secularization. He's also professor emeritus at Georgetown University, where he taught in the Department of Sociology and the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and has published works on a broad range of subjects, including religion and globalization, migration and religious pluralism, transnational religions, and sociological theory. Dr. Elaine Padilla is Associate Professor of Philosophy and Religion, Latinx, and Latin American Studies at the University of La Verne in California. Her research bridges theology, philosophy, and religious studies, touching about aesthetics, gender and race, migration, and Latin American thought. Her credited works include Ecological Solidarities, Mobilizing Faith and Justice for an Entangled World. Dr. Peter Phan is the inaugural holder of the Ignacio Ellacuría Chair of Catholic Social Thought in the Georgetown University Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and a faculty fellow at the Berkeley Center. His research deals with the theology of icons and Orthodox theology, patristic theology, eschatology, the history of Christian missions in Asia, and liberation, enculturation, and interreligious dialogue, and is the author of over 30 books and has published over 300 essays. Dr. Emily Ragnon is Professor of Systematic Theology at the Faculté Universitaire de Théologie Protestante de Bruxelles, as well as a teacher instructor at the Institut Catholique in Paris. Her works have been published in several languages and include Protecting Nature, Saving Creation, Ecological Conflicts, Religious Passions, and Political Quandaries. I'm very grateful to our guests in the audience and to this panel of scholars here to talk with us today. And I'd like to begin by asking Father Chrysavgis to start.
Thank you, Brian. It's an honor to participate on this panel. I wonder if there's a joke somewhere here like a patriarch, a pope, and an archbishop. But I won't go there. I want to divide my remarks into three parts in order to speak on the Green Patriarch, the Ecumenical Patriarch, and the joint statement. From even before his election and enthronement in 1991, I've been privileged to work closely with Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, and my ministry has essentially followed in his footsteps and shadow over the last 3 decades. Whether simply spending time with him at the FANAR or organizing international events or accompanying him on official visits, such as the one that opens in Washington, D.C. tomorrow, I'm grateful for this journey with His All Holiness. His ecumenical and his ecological vision has inspired and shaped my own ministry. In 1989, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, then through Bartholomew's predecessor, Demetrius, issued an annual encyclical on September 1st, establishing that day as the day of prayer for the natural environment. September 1st was subsequently adopted by all Orthodox churches in the 1990s, by the World Council of Churches and the Conference of European Churches at the turn of the millennium, and by Pope Francis and Archbishop Justin Welby of Canterbury for their communions in 2015 as the Day of Creation. Today, most of the Christian world celebrates the season of creation in September. Patriarch Bartholomew's conviction that creation care is a moral responsibility, that climate change is a result of human sin, have been defining aspects of his message over the last 25 years. 9 international symposia, 5 educational seminars, and to date, 4 focused summits established his reputation as the Green Patriarch. For 30 years, he has persistently advocated the protection of God's creation as a fundamental mandate of the Christian faith. He has fearlessly championed the importance of heeding and collaborating with science, and he has unabashedly proposed personal sacrifices as alternative solutions. His conviction, his claim, is that creation care is not merely a political or technological or fashionable exercise, it's fundamentally a spiritual issue. So the current crisis will be resolved only by addressing the moral causes of climate change, and this is precisely why religion has a vital role to play. But of course, Bartholomew is more than just the Green Patriarch. He's the Ecumenical Patriarch. And beyond the importance of his title and the implication of his position for the global Orthodox Church, it reflects and reinforces the ecumenical dimension of the Patriarch as a minister of dialogue and as a messenger of reconciliation. And so the Ecumenical Patriarchate has tirelessly defended ecumenical encounter for over a century, serving as a founder of the World Council of Churches and directing its Faith and Order Commission. Ecumenism is in the DNA of the FANAR, and Patriarch Bartholomew has been a staunch patron of ecumenical relations on the inter-Christian and on the inter-religious levels, above all with the Roman Catholic and the Anglican Communion, despite internal resistance and retaliation. So, for instance, in 2013, he attended the inaugural Mass of Pope Francis in St. Peter's Square, a spontaneous gesture signaling the first time that a leader of either church had ever participated in such an event in 2,000 years. In 2014, the 2 prelates traveled together to Jerusalem to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the historic visit there by their visionary predecessors, Pope Paul VI and Patriarch Athenagoras, who had revived ecumenical relations between the 2 sister churches after 500 years of complete estrangement and silence. So in 2015, when Pope Francis issued his environmental encyclical, Laudato Si', people were not entirely surprised that he singled out the exceptional example of Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. but they may have been unaware that this was the first time a papal encyclical referred at all, let alone so prominently, to an Orthodox prelate. It was also the first time that a papal encyclical was released jointly by Peter Cardinal Turkson from the responsible Pontifical Council and Metropolitan John of Pergamon, our senior Orthodox hierarch. Communications between the Fanar and the Vatican during that lengthy drafting process demonstrated yet another aspect of ecumenical conversation in the search for common witness. And then, in September 2017, Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope Francis issued their first joint encyclical on the World Day of Prayer for Creation. The close historical relations between the Ecumenical Patriarch and the Archbishop of Canterbury similarly resulted in collaboration on raising awareness about climate change, but also other issues, more recently, human trafficking. So in 2015, just after the release of Laudato Si', Bartholomew and Justin Welby produced a joint statement on climate change and moral responsibility, focused on the landmark Lancet report about the link between climate and health. Their statement underlined that our response to climate change will reduce human suffering and highlighted that humans are in a unique position to choose charity over greed and frugality over waste in our moral responsibility for neighbor and planet. And then came this latest joint statement. Efforts to produce the most recent joint statement by the three global Christian leaders began in late May 2021, when the Ecumenical Patriarch approached first Pope Francis with a view to preparing a statement along with the Archbishop of Canterbury for release on September 1st. All three prelates spontaneously agreed to publish what would be their first ever joint appeal, specifically targeting climate, not so much, or not primarily, or at least not exclusively in light of the forthcoming COP26 meeting of the United Nations in Glasgow, but with regard to the responsibility of all people of Christian faith and goodwill. What was different about this joint statement was that it was not managed or dominated by one or another party. It's always tempting and surely much simpler and smoother to have one side draft the document for consideration and approval by the others. And trust me, church leaders like assuming control over matters. But in this case, all three churches drafted the document together, with leadership assumed by the Patriarchate on the first section, by Canterbury on the second, and by the Vatican on the third. What was paramount was that the emphasis should be on a collaborative effort, with the three official seals and respective signatures bookending the document. Because you see, the power of ecumenical dialogue lies in opening up beyond ourselves, beyond our interests, beyond our persuasions. It's learning to speak the language of compassion, and above all, learning to give priority to service. And in this respect, creation care has a vital ecumenical dimension, inasmuch as it brings us, divided and insulated Christians, in a fragmented and partisan world before one critical common task that we are called to face together for the sake of future generations. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Christakis. Dr. Casanova.
Yes, thank you, Brian, and good evening, good afternoon, good day, whichever part of the planet you are, of our plasma planet, our common Earth. I'm going to make 4 brief points. I always do 3, but this time, to break the Trinitarian custom, I'm going to do 4. Brief because Reverend Christakis has basically said the most important points very closely to what I was going to say. The first one is a sociological one. The relevance of this document is precisely the fact that it is a religious, a spiritual, moral call to action. And this is what is truly relevant. Science, cognitive statements can convince us of something, but cannot move us to act. To act, we need a change of moral conviction and a change of heart. And this is what this document is. It's very clear, a call for metanoia, for change of behavior, for each of us individually. Because it will take precisely, we know we may be convinced, and we see public opinion convinced, but it's not sufficient. Conviction is not sufficient. We need really, really a change of heart on this issue, change our behavior. And so this is the really, really relevant aspect of this. Maybe secular people may not see it this way, but sociology knows that this is the relevance of religion or very, very deeply held ideologies that motivate people to act both individually and together collectively with others. It's the move to individual and collective action that is the relevant issue. Second, again, the joint statement is very important because it is a symbol of precisely the need to build bridges, the culture of the encounter, which is the only way we are going to basically not solve, but at least do something about the crisis if we act together transnationally across borders. And this is what this joint statement means symbolically. The leaders of 3 of the Christian churches really giving us an example of this need of building bridges and acting across borders. But of course, this is precisely because it points out this symbolic ecumenical message also makes evident the need to include many, many more voices into. So those voices which are not part of this statement. Obviously, we know that the Pope has worked together on similar statements with Muslim leaders. We know that the Buddhist tradition, the Dalai Lama has been also a world leader on these issues. So we need statements like this that goes beyond these 3 Christian leaders to really, really bring all religious leaders and secular leaders really, really on those statements. Then let me be realistic about the limits of these statements precisely because of the resistance that comes from internal divisions within the churches. We know that the ecumenical patriarch is facing a lot of resistance from the Moscow Patriarchate on all kinds of issues. This has been going on since the synod in Crete, and especially on the crisis of Ukraine. And it's very important that we realize that the ecumenical patriarch is doing this despite the accusations of other Orthodox leaders that basically, and even the prohibition on September 24th, the Russian Orthodox Church issued a prohibition to the ecumenical patriarch to speak in the name of world Orthodoxy. Fortunately, he does. And fortunately, despite the accusations and the fear that even the Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church may declare the patriarch anathema, nonetheless, it's very important that these things are being said and done. But the same thing happens within the Catholic Church. There's an internal division. The polarization that we see on these issues and all global crises of ecumenical, environmental, immigration and refugees, and the global health crisis, we know that the polarization within our political systems, the parties, that now has penetrated the churches. And so you have a lot of people within the Catholic Church that the very fact that the Pope makes this statement, simply they will discount it as ideological. And this is one of the problems we have, and we have to face it. Unfortunately, we cannot see those statements only as moral calls to action. They also appear to other people as simply representing ideologies. And so this is really, really the situation that we find ourselves, and the fact we have to be realistic on the impediments to listen to these documents with an open heart, because already we are close to those who speak because of what they represent. But finally, let me say, despite this, and there will be very critics, there will be also critics that will say, this is too little too late, given the very close relationship of the Anthropocene, of the damage done by the Anthropocene epoch, and the very close linkage we know between the Anthropocene and the anthropocentrism, which is so central to the Judeo-Christian tradition. That precisely we need much more. We need to go back to and to listen to other religious traditions which are not so anthropocentric and that have a much closer reverential attitude to nature as the sacred. So we need precisely to listen to these traditions and to the kind of radical ecologies that have developed also within the secular tradition. But this is a very important step. It's a step in the right direction that I hope that will lead to more and more common statements from other religious traditions and from secular ecological movements.
Thank you, Dr. Casanova. Dr. Padilla.
Good afternoon. In this brief presentation, I want to focus on the practice of listening to the cry of the earth and of the people who are poor, which to me is critical to developing an ethic of self-reflection on the human footprint and its impoverishing effects on the environment and vulnerable populations. Moreover, an ethic of listening holds the potential to move us beyond the limits of anthropocentric understandings of rationality and procure a far greater shift in our social and economic values globally. For these, an interspecies ethics of listening to the cries of the beyond human and poor alike must be considered. The very first act of listening in this document is linked to the cry of the earth and cannot be heard apart from the cry of those who are poor. In this admonition, we can hear echoing Leonardo Boff's systematic explanation on the vinculum between the oppression of the land and the marginalized communities of the world. In recent decades, the term that has been used is environmental racism. And although Boff did not use this term, as a Brazilian, he was among the first to associate the onslaught of technological progress on the Amazonian forests with the rise in slum living conditions of the poor who were being displaced from rural areas. In the first English version published in 1995, Boff said, quote, "The worst has happened. Human beings have become separated from the cosmic community and have forgotten the web of interdependencies and the synergy of all the cosmic elements that enable them to emerge in the cosmic process," end quote. Imagine if we would have heeded his warning 26 years ago. Perhaps Christians would be further along in promoting a new paradigm of connectedness and a covenant with nature with which to replace what Boff described as an ethic of utilitarianism and anthropocentrism. Those who are poor would have been viewed as agents and interdependent with the cosmic community. Particularly in Latin America, the indigenous and Afro populations were often the most exploited and the ones who have suffered the most from the loss of land would have been the most consulted in political and economic matters. Rather than ensuring remote systems of economic exchange that benefit only a foreign elite, a focus on their participation in decision-making processes would have been primary. Implicitly, the admonishment is to also examine a belief in a human consciousness that sets itself above all others and against the rest of living species that, just as the colonialist viewed itself as superior to the barbarian and savage. Both the Cartesian thinking and the disenchantment of the earth that have cloaked the immorality of destruction and oppression with an aura of remoteness and of sheer materiality have in some cruel way absolved societies of First Nations. So how can an ethic of listening that chooses life address the loss of subjectivity and agency of nature itself in processes of decision-making? We humans can admit the knowledge we can admit possessing the knowledge and technology with which to achieve global and regional forms of sustainable living. The problem, as it has been already mentioned, is with our social values, something that the church and believers of various faiths are particularly poised to offer an alternative approach. Certainly, with this joint message, all three leaders are unitedly arguing that humans are continuous with nature. But are they also explicitly calling for a paradigm in which humans are not viewed as superior, nor mere rational in every way, so as to reify the modern perspective that hyperbolizes the autonomy of the most rational humans among us? While the beyond human is no longer purely instrumental or a means to an end, is the human rationality the primary metric not being used for advocating human stewardship and guardianship? To me, the call falls short if it keeps in place forms of rationalism that too easily absolve humans from their sense of ecocide. Let's not forget our violations against the vulnerable. Rationalism, according to Val Plumwood, constructs, quote, dominant forms of rationality in terms of monological ways of organizing, end quote. She defines monological relationships as a major obstacle to, quote, negotiation, communication, and perception of the other's limits and agency, end quote. It promotes detachment, denies empathy, and fails to challenge the lowly status of nature and the marginalized. Nature and the poor are viewed as passively sharing their secrets with an empirical knower. An ethic of listening, therefore, would need to become dialogical. Nature, along with those who are poor, would be viewed as an agent, as subjects, and one who intends, learns, creates, designs, and communicates. Nature would be heard and engaged as a knowing partner. If considering compassion and shared responsibility as an aim in an ethic of listening, one could deeply contemplate on what Eduardo Kohn calls phantom-like signs that normally appear to be unidentifiable, yet can be felt. This manner of listening in the sense of sentir, or of feeling nature, refers to gifting back the world its quality of proximity and re-enchantment. In that regard, the most vulnerable and landless amongst us, including the beyond human, at the brink of extinction, can be heard communicating their present as much as their future cries. We can encounter each particularity as a self with a unique point of view. For Kohn, this would mean to acknowledge that the whole of life is soul-possessing. Thus, we can open ourselves to the conscious flow of intersubjective relations. To be indifferent to the sentir of other particularities is to suffer from what he calls soul blindness, or an inability to be aware. It is to experience, quote, an isolating state of monadic solipsism, end quote, that flattens reality, shuts the windows of the soul, and encapsulates an individual or the human collective as if devoid of interdependencies and interconnections. Therefore, while the call to listen to the cry of the earth and the cry of those who are poor remains relevant today, I wonder if by continuing to adopt the stewardship or guardianship model, the church fails to promote a way of life that evokes an increased capacity to feel deeply the entrails of the planet. The ecclesia, the one being called out to be a sacrament in the world, could listen to the knowledge and love embodied in and through the beyond humans, and further participate in an interspecies ethic with which to usher a new earth as much as a new heaven in our time. As the church groans together with the least of these, including the beyond human, it can adopt planetary values and not just human values that support an integral ecology. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Padilla. Dr. Fahn.
Good afternoon, good morning, good all. I am very, very honored to be sharing this panel with very distinguished speakers. From my interreligious perspective, the last point that Dr. Casanova mentioned, my task in this brief presentation is to explore how this joint statement would be received by the followers of non-Christian religions. Regarding Judaism and Islam, as they share with Christianity the belief in God the Creator, it is most likely that the joint message will strike a sympathetic chord, especially its notions of environmental sustainability, the impact of environmental destruction on the poor, and the necessity of global cooperation in the fight against climate change. As for Asian religions, many of which are non-theistic, the message reliance on the doctrine of divine creation appears alien to their teachings and may pose serious obstacles to its reception. In the interest of time, I will focus only on Buddhism. I argue that it is possible to examine the contribution of Buddhism to the joint message while bracketing the doctrine's reliance on the doctrines of God's creation. Thus, instead of creation to refer to the world, I will use the term samsara, the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Samsara is the world of suffering and dissatisfaction, the opposite of nirvana, which is the condition of being free from suffering and the cycle of birth and rebirth. Concerning Buddhism and ecology, there has recently been significant production of scholarly publications on this theme, as well as proliferations of Buddhist socio-political and spiritual associations of environmental activism. This interest in ecological thought and practice in Buddhism has been dubbed the greening Buddhism. The joint message opened with a lament about the devastating effects of COVID-19 pandemic and the ecological destruction, and urges us to, quote, listen to the cry of the earth and of people of the poor. It is noteworthy that the message, the joint message, speaks not only of the cry of the poor, but also, quote, the cry of the earth, as if the earth itself is a living and sentient being, like humans and animals. This view is not foreign to Buddhist thought, as I will make it clear below when I discuss the doctrine of codependent origination. The Buddha refers to this cry of humans, animals, and the earth as dukkha, translated as suffering. Of course, ecological destruction causes immense physical pains of all kinds, especially to the poorest of the poor, the animals and the material world, who, as the message notes, are the least responsible for environmental degradation. But dukkha also indicates a more existential suffering, a state of universal unease and disorder that cannot be cured with medicine or technology, but only with the true knowledge of its cause. The Buddha says that dukkha is caused by tanha, often translated as desire. A better translation is greed, covetousness, unending acquisitiveness, unfulfillable wanting, selfish attachment. This tanha, the Buddha says, is rooted not in a psychosis such as narcissism and egomania, but in the ignorance of the impermanence of all things. Greed produces suffering because one tries to grasp and hold as permanent something that is constantly passing. According to the Buddha, a remedy against desire and attachment and hence suffering is the practice of compassion, karuna, and loving kindness, metta, which must be extended not only to all humans, but also to animals, all animals, plants, and even natural elements. More generally, the Buddha describes in detail the path to liberation from tanha in his teaching on the so-called the Four Noble Truths. In Buddhist ecological thought, the precepts included in the Eightfold Path, namely right view, right speech, right action, and right livelihood, have been reformulated to promote the protection of the environment. Right view implies not only the correct understanding of the impermanence of all things and the connection between ignorance of this essential nature of things and suffering, but also a correct understanding of the causal correlation between certain human activities, such as fossil fuel and climate change. Not telling lies under the right speech proscribe not only falsehood telling, but also misleading advertising to promote ecologically destructive consumerism. Not taking life under right action includes not only not killing human life, but also doing no harm, ahimsa, to all living things and beings. Right livelihood commands avoidance not only of life-killing profession, but also the acquisition of unnecessary things. The remaining four paths, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration, and right resolve, can also be interpreted in a way that is conducive to ecological responsible living, insofar as they train the individual mind to gain true insight into the nature of things as suffering, impermanent, and interdependent. The impermanence and interdependence of all things on one another bring us to the ecological thought present in Mahayana Buddhism. Central to this Buddhist tradition is the concept of interdependent origination, pratitya samuppada, by which is meant that all things do not exist as independent or permanent entities or selves, but are constantly changing and co-arising dependently on other things, which are also co-arising dependently on the things that co-arise dependently on them. The doctrine of interdependent origination is expressed in the following third formula. I quote, when this is, that is. This arising, that arises. When this is not, that is not. This ceasing, that ceases, unquote. As a result of interdependent origination, there is nothing permanent and substantial. In terms of ecological thought, the Buddhist concept of interdependent origination implicitly rejects the technocratic paradigm, which views the world, the samsara, in terms of subject-object for domination and exploitation. Interdependent origination affirms universal and mutual condition among all things. No beings can exist without the other. No one person without other persons, humanity without ecology, and vice versa, ecology without humanity. Hence, because of interdependent origination, humanity and ecology inter-are, to use a verb by a Vietnamese Buddhist, Thich Nhat Hanh. Interbeing is the only mode of existence possible, not only among humans themselves, but also between humanity and ecology. The animals and the material world are not just objects for humans as subject to manipulate, dominate, and exploit. Their value and worth are not measured by their usefulness to humans. Rather, they possess the autonomous value in themselves because they and we co-arise interdependently. Without them, we cannot exist, and vice versa. Without us, they cannot exist. They and we inter-are. In conclusion, Buddhist ecological thought, with its emphasis on both correct knowledge and ethical practice, can help us bring about, quote, the ecological conversion that the joint statement advocates. That's why an interreligious approach beyond the ecumenical or including ecumenical is urgently called for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Phan. And finally, Dr. Reinen.
Yes, thank you, and good evening to everyone. As I am now in the 7th year of the 7th decade of my life on Earth, I have accumulated memories, to start with childhood and the experience of the so-called natural world. Like all my contemporaries, I can testify to the tangible loss of biodiversity. When we were 6, insects were far more numerous. Remember how after a drive, windscreens were streaked with their small corpses, or on a more upbeat mode, how we see dragonflies and ladybugs and hear the symphony of toads and frogs at dusk. Yet the silencing of spring was already underway. Quote, no enemy action had silenced the rebirth of new life in this stricken world. The people had done it themselves, end of quote, as Rachel Carson wrote in 1963. Also, the glaciers of the Alps of my earlier years were visibly larger. They have dwindled before our eyes. We perceive today's world as deteriorated, but for our grandchildren, it may seem a far better one than the world they will in turn inhabit. To quote the joint message, tomorrow could be worse. Today's children and teenagers will face catastrophic consequences unless we take responsibility now, end of quote. Another shift I have experienced has to do with the subject matter of theological studies. In my case, at least, when I was a young student in seminary, ecology was not a prominent topic. The precariousness of life on this planet was regarded, if at all, through the prism of the atomic peril. If we thought about the possibility of collective extinction, it was connected to the nuclear winter in the long aftermath of the Cold War. At the end of the 90s, sheer accident forced me to confront the teachings of my own tradition regarding the place and agency of human beings within the whole of creation. I was asked to give a paper, stepping in for a senior colleague, at the colloquium organized by the Green Patriarch in September 1998 in Constantinople, Istanbul. The topic was monotheistic spiritualities and the environment. This leads me to a first critical remark about the statement. More than 2 decades ago, Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars, as well as secular scientists, were convened for the above mentioned dialogue by Bartholomew I. Around the turn of the millennium, a group of mostly liberal Jewish scholars and leaders wrote a powerful invitation to all of Christianity, Dabru Emet. It was addressed to all Christian churches. More recently, Pope Francis was able to enter a meaningful conversation with a Muslim scholar and leader in Abu Dhabi in February 2019. Together, they conveyed an urgent appeal to the fraternal collaboration of all human beings in a common statement. Pope Francis then built on this dialogue with the great Imam Ahmad al-Tayeb in the encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti. Now, for sure, the joint message is a landmark in ecumenical relations. The 3 leaders have never before found themselves at the bottom of the same page. My critical remark concerns the lack of ambition of the initiative. Why not invite the Jewish signatories of Dabru Emet and the Muslim partner of Pope Francis as well. It would have been a powerful image, even if the message might have had to be whittled down even more. There is much common ground between the three monotheistic world religions. The diversity of parties involved in the COP26 of the United Nations is in that sense fuller and broader and should humble us Christians. My second critique is aimed at the illusion of consensus. It has said before that the authority of the leaders is being contested by groups that are not merely on the fringe of the faithful. Yet they speak as if there now existed a consensus about the following insight on page 6 of the statement: caring for God's creation is a spiritual commission. Now, I personally agree with this key formulation, but we must heed the dissenting voices of other Christians who believe it is God who cares for God's creation. Also, they would protest because creation has come uncoupled from redemption. Many of our evangelical sisters and brothers within the Anglican Communion and elsewhere believe that the spiritual commission of the Church is primarily to proclaim the good news about eternal life. Stewardship or responsibility for our God-given earthly endowment being secondary. Now, to gloss over that long tradition that prays with the Book of Common Prayer, that we so pass through things temporal that we lose not hold on things eternal, and to ignore the tension between last things and penultimate realities, is to weaken the position of ecologically informed theology. My thesis is that what is not addressed festers and gathers strength. One is reminded of the critique by John Milbank, not so much evangelical as Barthian, in his text Out of the Greenhouse. In the false spring of our times, Milbank writes, everything is painted green. It has become the appointed liturgical color for our post-historical Sabbath, end of quote. This was Milbank. Now, to take the opposition seriously does not mean to deny the imperative of solidarity with all God's creatures. On the contrary, it should impel us to consider to what extent we are not only victims or powerless onlookers of the current ecological crisis, but to some extent complicit or responsible because of the tradition that we embody. My final critique concerns the illusion of innocence. Saint Augustine compared our life on earth with the journey one undertakes to cross through a country in order to reach another final destination. This belief was a great comfort to many. We mustn't forget to remind ourselves. Yet, if a heavenly home is the true destination, then what becomes of the earth and all who breathe in it? The joint statement does not dwell on this, only mentioning both the realities of the present and the promise of something larger than what we see in a moment. We must acknowledge that Christian teachings have indeed in the past sanctioned disregard for the environment. If we have now tacitly turned away from this belief, should we not first take stock and recognize that innocence is an illusion. In short, and to finish, areas of the joint statement are the lack of ambition in not including the leaders of other living faiths, the weakness of not addressing the tensions within the Christian faith about temporal and eternal concerns, and the failure to underline that Christian theology, by its concentration on the redemption of humankind, has sometimes been understood as the license to exploit and disregard the non-human parts of this world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Reinen, and thank you to all of our panelists for giving us a lot to work with, I think, this afternoon, this morning, this evening, depending upon location. Let me remind you, those who have signed in, perhaps, that there is an opportunity to ask questions using the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. And to get our conversation started, I'm trying to find some ways of putting people in a conversation together. It seems like one question that is raised and that Professor Reinen has raised quite clearly is the question about the possibilities and the limitations of interreligious contribution here. So we have Dr. Casanova and Dr. Reinen asking for a stronger interreligious dialogue. And at the same time, we have Peter Phan showing the possibilities of greater understanding from the Buddhist tradition. I wonder, Father Christakis, whether a more interreligious statement was considered, and to see if anyone of the other panelists want to talk about some of the possibilities of interreligious and the limitations of interreligious cooperation here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the criticism, both of Peter and Anne-Marie. Yes, it was considered very seriously. However, this statement perhaps needs also to be seen in light of or alongside of another statement that was signed almost simultaneously by the three leaders, together with leaders of all religious groups in the world. It is true that Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, from the very outset, has always included in the conversation of his symposia and the summits an interfaith element, and the presence always of at least Muslim scholars and Jewish scholars. That was certainly something that was a part of his vision throughout his tenure. Even tomorrow, when he arrives in the US, he won't come with just Orthodox representatives, but there will be someone from Turkey, a Muslim friend of his, that will accompany him on his visit. That's always been his practice whenever he's traveled, in fact. So there was an interfaith statement that was signed on the 4th of October at the Vatican in Rome, that was being prepared from January of this year, and which the three leaders, all of them present in Rome to sign that document as well, discussed the fact that an interfaith document is crucial, but they didn't want their own people. I mean, this notion that Anne-Marie said, you know, this consensus of opposition within their own traditions, or this emphasis on, you know, in Augustine, which is totally, you know, unrelated to the Eastern experience. You know, someone like Simeon, a new theologian in the 10th century, says, if you don't see God in this world, in creation, in your lifetime, you shouldn't expect to see him some other time or somewhere else. That's been more the drive of the Eastern Orthodox sort of tradition, as opposed to Augustine. We love to bash Augustine in the Eastern Church, but that's easy as well. And the West does that as well now. But the three leaders, I think, felt that it is equally important for them to address climate change from a Christian perspective in order to underline to their own constituents that this is not just some vague interfaith or sentimental or universal sort of cosmic unity that we're in harmony that we're seeking, but it does stem, it does originate and does impact the very core of their Christian teaching. The fact that we worship a God in the Christian church that assumed human flesh, that was baptized in water in the Jordan, means that we cannot avoid this emphasis on discerning God, seeing God, experiencing God in the midst of creation. That it is a paradox, it is wrong, it is ironical that Christians will pray for their children's souls to be saved in the kingdom of heaven when their children won't even have a place on earth. So that was definitely in the mind of the three leaders, and they wanted almost to give that dual dimension to their constituents.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to comment on this question about the possibilities and the limitations of interreligious cooperation?
Briefly on this point, I understand perfectly Father John's explanation of the origin and the purpose of the joint statement. However, it is clear that when you use the term protection of creation, it resonates with Christians or Muslims or even Jews, but certainly not with the majority of Asian religions. So if you want to have a joint statement, interreligious statement, certain very specific Christian term and doctrine should not, I do not mean that it had to be abandoned, but it cannot be used as the focus of the statement. Second point, I have no time to talk about this, but I noticed the paradigm of stewardship in the second paragraph of the joint statement. Again, this is a much better paradigm than exploitation and use, but stewardship still put the human person on top of the others. I own it, I use it reasonably and wisely, so I keep the stewardship. The Buddhist and the Asian tradition do not have that concept. The concept is that we are mutually. I don't exist without the water, without the air, and the air doesn't exist without me. It's not that me, I simply be a good steward of creation, but I accept the fact that I'm interdependent on the origination. That is a very different view of the ecological responsibility.
Thank you. I want to move to one question from the chat, as well as a connection that I saw coming up in your presentations. And in some ways, it goes to a question from the chat about how should Roman Catholic and Orthodox theologians, lay people, respond to this resistance, the resistance that Dr. Casanova reflected upon. How do people in our daily life respond to that? It seems to me that's related to Professor Reinen's conversation about the illusion of consensus and the need to respond clearly and yet honestly about the fact that this is a statement by three leaders of three very mainline, very established Christian institutions, but by no means is shared by all of our fellow Christians, even before we enter the religious conversation. And we'd like to reflect on some of those concerns.
If I may, the problem is that the more honest we are in recognizing also, if you wish, the contribution of our Christocentrism to our humanism, to our anthropocentric exploitation of the earth, then the more resistant there will be on these people even. So there is a, yes, we need to be honest. We need to recognize our own culpability, recognize the weakness of the Christian tradition, and to enter into dialogue with other religions. But this will even create a greater resistance from many Christians. So it's a very difficult, I think, but we need to be honest. We need to be honest despite everything. And so, yes, with ourselves and with others, with our tradition. And we see it now, the resistance of many Catholics in Spain, Latin America, especially in Spain, and even the celebration of the cinquentenary of the conversion, of the colonization of the Americas, and even to any kind of critique of the racism, of the colonialism, which has been part of the Catholic Church. And a lot of people don't want to hear it. We see the resistance in the United States on all these issues. So yes, we need to be honest, but we also must be aware that it will only create greater resistance.
I might say, if that's okay, Brian, it's important for the Christian leaders and generally for religious leaders not to think that they have the answers. If they had the answers, then we wouldn't have any problem. If they had the answers, then Moscow and Athens should be beautifully transformed climate-aware cities, and they're not. So the sense of humility that religion and the churches in particular came into this conversation very late and very reluctantly, after science was for a long time telling us what the truth was. So even whether it's the patriarch or the Pope, they're not leaders, they're still really followers, but they do have an impact. Religion does have an impact on people's lives and people's choices. And then secondly, to reflect on what several people mentioned, this notion of making connections, of opening our eyes and not being blind in our soul, of listening. It's important for people in their own sort of even narrow circles to make connections between their faith and their life. And I think this is where what Francis, what Bartholomew, what Justin, what they say can make a difference, because so often we disconnect from the choices we make and the lifestyles we adopt. And to touch on this stewardship model, I agree wholeheartedly. The Patriarchate has had entire discussions on this with our leading theologian, Metropolitan John of Pergamon, about how the notion of stewardship is, in fact, not the right way to go. But I have found that you tell people stewardship's not the best concept to use, and they say, okay, let's talk about stewardship. I say, no, stewardship is not the way to go. And they say, okay, let's go with stewardship. So I say, fine, let's talk about stewardship. If that's going to help move the conversation on, then that's fine. It's not the answer, but it's not dwelling, let's say, sometimes on maybe the wrong aspect.
Thank you. A question from our audience, asking particularly about Professor Padilla's ethic of listening to the cry of the earth and actually figuring out ways to listen to that in a non-hierarchical way. The question asker talks about the fact that global women are disproportionately affected by climate change disasters, but they also play important leading roles in eco-justice movements. So this statement, Rosemary Carbine talks a lot about intergenerational concerns, but overlooks women's and voices and intersectional issues. So what would an ecofeminist viewpoint, or more of an ecofeminist viewpoint, contribute to this conversation, or might have contributed to this document had it been more integral to it? I'll start with Dr. Padilla for this, I think.
Oh, here you are. Thank you so much for the question, and thank you, Brian, for the opportunity to answer it. I was, when I read the question, I thought immediately of the choosing life is one of the statements that are made by the joint message. And when we think of life, of course, my mind goes to books or writings like Our Cry for Life or of Life by Maria Pilar Aquino, and it also, which engages many scholars from Latin America, feminist scholars from Latin America, and I'm also directed to think of activists who are women who are conducting or really creating great organizations that are aiming at addressing ecological issues in their countries, in India, in China, in Africa. There are so many examples of that, and I would say that Rosemary Carbine is right on target. And I would also wanted to mention a movement within the Catholic Church, especially a group of sisters that congregate and do a tremendous work together. If you don't mind, I did have a paragraph that I extracted, and I just said, let me leave it just in case somebody asks a question. And so I'm going to go ahead and read it, if that's okay. Okay. So this is based on an interview with Sister Gail Borchello from Green Mountain Monastery. She was explaining to me how her community of sisters integrate the holy beings of the earth community into their liturgical life. For them, the entire mountain is their monastery, hence the name of Green Mountain Monastery. An innumerable amount of living things are the residents and members of their community. So in listening to them, she adds, quote, "We are continually shaken out of our complete anthropocentric viewpoint," end quote. And then she was talking about Robert, a butterfly with a torn wing that appeared in their space. And she said, quote, "He appeared and called forth practices that we could have not designed ourselves, practices that deepen our sense of care, compassion, and love for the loveliest." And I wanted to say that because I believe that there is a tremendous amount of work that we fail to engage, that is coming from our religious communities per se, and also from activists around the world that are also women that are making a great impact. And I just wanted to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Reiner, I think you have a comment as well.
Yes, this may be a slightly different track, but it's a question that has been puzzling me regarding the use of the word, the concept of household, the common house, the common household. I think it's a notion that is probably more counterproductive in that it solidifies and sanctions a certain order that is anthropocentric, that goes without saying, and also to some extent dominated by the head of the household.
I think we may be having some internet issues. While we're waiting for Professor Reinen to return, I mean, one of the questions that's been coming up in a couple of ways in our conversation from the questions online is thinking about what some of these resources might be from other places. So one commenter asked particularly about how might resources coming from African contexts be a resource for thinking differently about the relationship of humans to their environment. Others refer to indigenous communities. But I'm also wondering what are both the strengths and the limitations of that kind of contextual analysis. What's helpful about that, possibly what might be romanticizing or idealistic about that, this sort of encountering nature in ways that are different than more traditional Western Christian stewardship models.
If I may, I think the issue here is humility and being able to listen to everybody. Nobody has the solutions. And ultimately it's a change of heart. So any help we get to convince each other of the need to do something is welcome. So the humility of not thinking that basically it is the Christianity, the Western tradition, humanism that basically has the solutions. So, and again, Professor Reinen, you are back, so please, you can continue what you were saying, because it was precisely in this direction also.
Has the question been understood? I don't want to be too long.
We
because
missed,
I really Yes?
We missed the beginning of it, so please restate.
So my question is concerning the use of the concept of common household to talk about the ecological responsibility. It's very prominent in Laudato Si, and I think it may be counterproductive because it does not give justice to the strangeness and the undomesticated nature of nature.
Maybe I just wanted to say that the household is also related, of course, to oikos, and we know how, oikonomy and the household. So there are all kinds of connections which are problematic.
And this seems also to me, and perhaps Dr. Padilla might expand a bit, this seems to me an interesting parallel of your critique of the rationalism of some of these concepts and the continuum in some ways of devaluing humans on the basis of a supposed rationality and devaluing nature on a basis of whether they belong to the household or not, and that. Do you think that makes sense, or do you think that's too much of a stretch?
Well, part of what we see is that if we were to see them as part of our household, they probably would be our servants, or they probably would be, which is what we have done with many of the, the so-called, developing countries or third nations. It's just that we have had an understanding of rationality that places First Nations as the ones that have the know-how and the skill set, the technology. Of course, they take they drain the brains of other nations so that they can have and possess that technology and that knowledge, rather than really invest in other countries to also develop actually more earth-centered forms of technology. And I think that my critique is that when I read works of thinkers that are doing ecological work, that are theologians, they're really seeking to do more earth-centered theologies and engage in more earth-centered ethics. And so we have sort of a combination or a dialogue that doesn't seem to be really listening to each other and learning. And so part of I guess if I were to say we see the beyond human world as part of the household, it would have to be a very truly welcome combination, or a truly welcome dialogue, and not a perspective that there is still an above and a below. And so somehow we have to keep disrupting these categories, and I think we are headed in the right direction. We still have a little ways to go, though.
Which brings me to a question about, in some ways, the reception of this statement. So one question, someone speaking from the Indonesian context, but I think it's true for a number of contexts, is the practical question, well, what good do these statements do? Another question from someone who's an evangelical Christian excited is their interest in this outside of the Orthodox Catholic and Anglican communities. But I also think that reflects some questions of what's going on in the communities in which you're in touch. How is this being received? Is it being received? What would non-reception even look like?
I already mentioned the fact that this document, which is theistic, clearly, will find very difficult reception among the non-theistic believers. So that's one thing. The second thing I would like to say is also that we should avoid romanticizing any particular religious tradition. I talk about Buddhism, but it's not the same as the Buddhists. The Buddhists who are today are welcoming all kinds of technological innovations that globalization brings to them, and with very little, the government with very little concern for the environment. Just think of China, for instance, the way they use the fossil fuel. So to talk about a particular religious tradition and view on the ecology does not mean that all the followers follow the same thing, do the same thing. And the same thing to have to be said about Christians. This document is wonderful. It's short. It can be read in about half an hour, and people can read them rather than a lengthy apostolic exhortation, Laudato Si. But again, the teaching of the Catholic Church, or Orthodox Church, or Anglican Church, I hope that they do not think, oh, from now on, Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglicans are all perfect practitioners of environmental responsibility. So the need of listening to one another, the need of not romanticizing a particular tradition, and learning, willingness to learn from all tradition is something that we can move towards what Brian called the reception of this document.
We also to comment on how this document is currently being received, or how you think it ought to be received or not received.
I mean, I think that sociologically, I can say that the strength of these religious communities, these three big churches, is that they precisely function at very different levels. Obviously, this is a statement, it's a cognitive statement, and as the person from Indonesia, it may not appeal to regular, ordinary people. But the fact is that these churches are also very, very embedded in ordinary parishes. And so the question is, they have the mechanisms to turn this purely Viewist text into a project that can be translated into, you know, the Pope Francis, the social movements in Latin America, the 3 T's, sin techo, sin trabajo, sin tierra. I mean, there are these connections which are so deep. And this is of course, that's why these churches have such great responsibility, because they have not only the intellectuals, and they, of course, have also very wealthy people, which are patrons of those churches, and that may have also some contribution to make. So let's hope that that does not remain a statement there, but it really becomes a way of being translated, institutionalized into the life of those churches. Let's hope.
And perhaps not just a contribution to make, but if Professor Reinen's discussion of the illusion of innocence is correct, also have some responsibility for their past and for some of how we got some of our power and influence, institutionality. That also might be part of more of a conversation about ecclesial sin. Might need to be part of this as well. A question, a commenter quotes from the document, caring for God's creation is a spiritual commission requiring a responsive commitment. For all the panelists, how do you think this point of the statement could influence the implementation of the Paris Global Agreement during the COP26, particularly the Book of Rules for the implementation? I'm not sure what that is, but how should this be affecting delegates to Glasgow next weekend?
I mean, this is the different question, the relation between the religious and the secular, right? To which extent secular authorities take this when they need it and not. So I think we need the states, we need the United Nations, we need the world system of states, geopolitics, to also get on board. But we know, and this is the argument that Pope Francis makes so strongly in Fratelli Tutti, the COVID crisis has shown the limitations of our global system of governance to be able to address those issues because of the built-in structure in the global capitalist system to basically not being able to respond to issues of inequality and discarding of half of the population. And we know the world system of states is so the national security interest is the near reflex response. So let's hope that somehow the leaders are not only politicians, but also accept this responsibility as human beings to respond to a change of heart. But again, this is hope. We need to hope. And otherwise...
I wonder if I can just add something here, Brian. I just want to remind people it might be helpful to look at the document that was the interfaith statement produced and signed on October 4th. It is very different. The language is not Christian language. It is far broader, more sort of cosmic and interfaith language. So I do think that people were involved from all religious faiths and produced a document much longer for my liking, but nonetheless a more interfaith document, and one that was directly addressed to the COP leaders. The joint statement signed by the three Christian leaders had a different sort of focus, and it was an appeal really, I mean, obviously generally to people of goodwill, but for the most part for people within the three churches. Because look, Jose said earlier about, you know, too little, too late. And Elaine spoke about there's a lot more to do. And that's exactly right. It is a matter of humility, as it has been said already, which literally means putting your ear down to the ground, you know, feeling the pulse of the earth, not preaching first and foremost. So one act of humility that would behoove, I think, all of us as Christians, and certainly the three leaders that were signing this document, is just how have we interpreted the message of the gospel up until today, which may well have been perverted, distorted. You know, we use oikos, and of course we're unhappy with it, because of course, as it was said, you know, we're treating people as servants. But how did we get to that point when the Christian message is about servanthood? It's about the leaders being the servants. So how did we end up twisting that, you know, through, whether it's through rationalization, whether it's through Western civilization? So learning to question even our own understanding of the gospel within the Christian tradition is a crucial lesson to learn, I think.
I want to also speak to the crisis in rationality that we can observe among our political leaders, the manner in which the church and religious leaders are also positioned to talk about the manner in which we favor a system that, unless we truly shifted, and I would say to replace it with a system that, and I'm not talking about you know, socialism versus democracy or any kind of you know, shifting like that, as much as truly addressing how progress and development and even green technologies are put in place without looking at the effects that it can have locally, or without truly shifting from the more global to the regional, to the local, and trying to listen to the communities, the local communities, and engage them in their decision-making processes. I think that similarly, and I think that the church and religious leaders are in a great position to be a part of this dialogue that is a secular public dialogue. They are in a great position to also make an impact. I think that when we get organized as religious peoples, we can make an impact. And the situation is that oftentimes we just stay too secluded within the walls of our institutions.
Another reason surely for humility. I mean, you know, at least in the case of the Pope and the Patriarch, we're talking about two traditions that are hardened hierarchical traditions that have excluded women for centuries and still do. There's a lot of learning to do, and there's a lot of humility to be included here. But I honestly do feel that it's not coincidental that we have someone like Francis and someone like Bartholomew as heads of these two churches. That I don't expect the shift that Elaine's talking about to happen overnight. Nothing happens overnight in the Catholic or the Orthodox Church. But if you can just jolt the building for a minute, maybe something good will come out of that shake. So I agree, but it's a long-term process, and it's a blessing for me that these two people are leading their churches at this time. And if they're getting resistance, for me, that's a sign that they might be on the right path.
Yes, I agree with that. I would just like to add that maybe we make the mistake sometimes of opposing state leaders and government policymakers and church people. Now, we each have a realm of competence. You know, a theologian is not a chemist, but a policymaker may well be a Christian or a person of faith. And so it is important that these messages be short and put in a language that is accessible for every person of goodwill, because we must not suppose a separation where there may well be a communication.
And that might be, I teach a lot of undergraduate students. In my intro to theology, we conclude with Laudato Si. And I always make sure to point out how important it is that Pope Francis lifts up Patriarch Bartholomew as someone, as I say, who was doing ecological work before it was cool. And I think one of the things I try to convince them is that the churches and our religious traditions, our wisdom traditions, can be, if we let them, one of the biggest sources for renewal, one of the surest foundations for responding to the crises, the climate crisis and the other ecological crises of our time, because they're about conversion to wanting to use the technological solutions, to wanting to make the policy changes, to choosing to live differently. But as we know from our traditions, conversion is not usually getting knocked off one's horse. Conversion usually is a lifelong process. So I think today's conversation was a great part of continuing in that process. I hope to see what we can find in the September 1st, 2022 joint statement and who will be involved and what it will say. For now, though, I want to again thank our panelists for their attention, for their work, for the ideas. I think we can all enter into the weekend knowing more, but also having more to think about how we ourselves are going to choose life and to choose to live differently. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your attendance and wish everyone a good evening.